Hey everyone, how's it going? Welcome back to the 6th and final week of this hands-on with Maxon beginner Cinema 4D workshop in version 25. And for the last time during this course, I am joined with my good friend Matt. How's it going, Matt?
It goes okay, thank you. Yes, Cat is here for everybody who asked last time, and the 3D motion show, famous Cat. Yeah, it's
The
all good. How
famous
are
Cat
you?
now. I'm
I
very
did.
good, yeah. I'm sad it is the final week. I can't believe how quickly it comes round.
Yeah, that's gone fast. That's 6 weeks gone in one go, isn't
It
it?
really has gone quickly, yeah. But it's been a lot of fun, and we've still got a whole 2 hours left. So, for anyone who is new, the idea of the last 6 weeks was to get you guys comfortable in Cinema 4D in just 6 weeks. So, we break this down into 6 different topics. We had a getting started, we looked at some modeling, we then dove into some lighting and materials, and then had a look at some animation and dynamics. And last week we went into MoGraph. And some of you may be aware, some of you may not be aware, we actually record all of these sessions as well as all of the other webinars that we do, and they can be found on our Maxon Training Team YouTube channel. So all you have to do is go onto YouTube, type in Maxon Training Team, and then scroll down, and there's a playlist titled Hands On with Maxon, and you can find them all on there. So as we're saying, this is the final week, and it's going to be all things to do with rendering. So it's really going to kind of finish off this whole journey of getting into Cinema 4D as a beginner. Yes, final week, my sad little crying emoji here. So what are we going to be taking a look at today? So the idea of this session is we are going to basically learn how to render inside of Cinema 4D using the standard and the physical renderers. So people may not know that we actually have default renderers inside of Cinema 4D. So you don't just have to use third-party ones, they actually have some included. And those are the ones we're going to be looking at for the majority of this session. We're also going to understand what ambient occlusion is and also global illumination. So we had a little look at GI when we looked at lighting, but we're also going to have a look at ambient occlusion and some other render settings that kind of affect our renders quality and also time. We're also going to look at differences between rendering for stills versus rendering for animation and how we would set up each of the different kind of functions. And we might even take a look at some additional options like depth of field, motion blur, magic bullet looks, all of that kind of fun stuff, as well as looking at setting up multipasses and alpha channels, which we know is a kind of a question we get asked quite often when we talk about rendering. And so normally, those of you that have seen these sessions before, these hands-on sessions, the first half is more kind of what other tools, how do we use them, how do they work? And then the second half is normally practical. But as we kind of said last week, rendering as a topic is a little bit different. And so the second sort of hour, we're going to look at diving into some different color workflows. So someone asked about MoGraph Colour last week, and we also talked about vertex maps and how you can kind of adjust textures with vertex maps. So I thought I'd spend the second half of this session going through how we can set up those different color workflows inside of both Cinema 4D and inside of Redshift. So I'll also be demoing a bit of Redshift, a little bit of the lighting, a little bit of the render settings, and then hopefully also a couple of like node materials, because unfortunately we can't do a massive introduction to Redshift because we just don't have the time. But I'm sure at some point, maybe next year, we might do one of these hands-on sessions focused on Redshift. I would like to. So for the final time, let's get started. Matt, are you ready to take over?
If I say no, how can
Um,
we just can we just keep going?
well,
It
I can
won't
keep
end.
talking. You know me, I can always keep talking. Also, hey to Javier, hey to Rick, to Tasso, to
Hey,
Pete, to
potato.
Pamela, morning or afternoon or evening, depending where you're all from. And to Leslie, give us a little hey where you're from, and we'll shout you guys out. And as always, keep your questions and your conversation coming. We like this to be super interactive anyway, so just let us know.
Right, okay, so let's have a look at rendering then inside of Cinema 4D. R25, of course. It hasn't changed much, it's just the buttons have moved slightly. So the biggest thing to look at over here, if we want to look at render settings, is this button here. So it's a little cogwheel film clacker. And that brings up our standard Cinema 4D window as we would expect to see. So very little difference than anything else, to be perfectly honest. We have our renderer drop down. So of course I can choose standard, physical, viewport renderer, or Redshift. I'll go through the settings of those and the differences a bit later. For the moment, I'm just going to go through like actually how to set up a render, which is obviously quite important once you've done all of your funky and amazing things inside of Cinema 4D. The question is, how do I actually make a file? And that's what we'll look at now. So with our standard renderer selected, I'm going to look at the output. Now, this is exactly as it seems. What is the output that you want Cinema 4D to render? What do you want to create? So here are the settings for this. You've got a lovely little drop down and you can choose all sorts of things. You've got screen resolutions, you've got square resolutions, you've got stuff for film and video. Look at that, that's getting bigger and longer every time. You've got mobile devices. They finally got rid of the iPod. I'm very disappointed. But nonetheless,
Oh,
it will
no.
do.
Poor
I know,
iPod.
finally. I know, it's like no one uses one anymore. But obviously you've got all of the various useful sizes of things like that. And this one I like as well, which is print portrait and print landscape. And the useful thing about these is if you go to one of these, it instantly changes the measurement that you are using into centimeters and changes your resolution to 300 pixels per inch, which makes this much more, makes the resolution much better for actually being able to print. Whereas if you go to any of these screen or videos, you can choose like that one, and you'll see that the frame rate's 29.97 and the pixels per inch are 72, which is kind of standard. You're unlikely to need to change any of these, but you can change your frame rate if you want to. The other thing to be aware of underneath is the frame range. So what is this going to render? This is going to render, funnily enough, the current frame. And by current frame, it means whatever frame my animation preview is set to. So you can see I'm just grabbing the blue time slider here, and that denotes the frame that it is going to use. I'm currently just doing current frame, so it will only show one frame. I can drop down if I'm going to do an animation, and I can choose all frames, which funnily enough will do all of my frames from 0 all the way to 90, or however long your animation chooses to be. You can do a preview range, and this preview range at this particular point is exactly the same, but the preview range is denoted by this little slider bar, which I can click and drag one end. And now my preview range shortens what I can see in my time slider here. So it shows that it says it's at 10 and it finishes at 63. And funnily enough, that's exactly what I've got with my preview range here. Starts at 10, goes to 63. You can also go to manual if you particularly want, and this does from and to. So I can actually choose to go from frame 0 to frame 10. Now, one question that we do often get asked about this is, can you set different frame ranges? So if I wanted it to do frames 0 to 10, and then 15 to 25, and then 35 to 100, the answer is no. You need to manually set each one of those up. So sadly, you cannot set up kind of batches of frame ranges in this way. So let's choose something that I'm going to use. 1080. I suppose that's probably the best one, isn't it? 1280 by 1080, something like that. No, what do I want? I want 1980 by 1080. What do you?
1920 by 1080. That's what
Yeah,
I do. HD.
which one do you? That's that one, isn't it? Yeah. Because for some reason it always registers the height rather than the width. So I'm always looking for 1920 and it's not there. So we've got our size of our image and I'm choosing the number of frames. And actually I'm going to go back to current frame because I'm only going to render an image of something, or at least that's what I'm setting up for at the moment. And that's me done. I then go to the save section, which as you can see already has a tick in the box because it's assuming you're going to want to render this out and save it somewhere. It has this big blank section here and the 3 dots. And the 3 dots, if you click, it says, where do you want to save your file? And it brings you up the normal standard, either Mac or Windows file browser. So we call it preview render, and then click save. Okay, you can see that it gives you the name preview render. It gives you the file location there as well. You must click that box. If you just put the word in preview render in this box, it doesn't know where to save it, so it won't. You can then choose your file format. So you can choose anything from bitmaps to HDRs, TIFFs, PNGs for image formats, including layered formats such as PSD. Or if you're going for animations, you can go for MOV if you're on a Mac, MP4 if you're on both, and I think you can still do AVI on a PC, I think. But there you go, you choose your file format that you want to work. So I'm just going to go for PNG, which is fine for me at this particular point. Multipass I will come back to when we look at the multipass section. Anti-aliasing. Now, anti-aliasing, I'm assuming a lot of people in 3D will know, and particularly gamers will know as well. Aliasing is where Cinema 4D is displaying stuff that is at an angle via rows of pixels. So you know that your screen is made up of little blocks of pixels, okay? When something traverses, like crosses them, screens have a tendency of aliasing, and they go, right, okay, I'm displaying on 2 pixels here and 2 pixels here and 2 pixels here, 2 pixels here. And what you end up with is these little straight jaggedy lines. It's very difficult to show on my screen because the resolutions now are so high, you very rarely notice it. But if you were to render that, obviously that's how it would do it. And you would have all of these little stepped straight lines, which of course is not how real life works. So when you are using the standard renderer, you need, if you're going to render out an image, change it from geometry to best, and that will give you a much better resolution. I wouldn't mess with the minimum and maximum level that much, or in fact at all, because it can add days to your rendering time. So at the moment, I'm just going to use that. You may want to change your filter. If you're doing a still image, choose still image. If you're doing an animation, choose animation. Okay, so that one's fairly simple. The rest I will ignore. Options. Now, most of the time you won't need to have anything to do with this, but it is a really nice and quick way of being able to turn on and off things in your scene, like shadow, reflection, refraction, transparency. Okay, you can turn those on and off in here really quickly. The majority of these you won't need to worry about, okay, and you can ignore, but there's some useful things over here on the right hand side, particularly reflection depth. Now, in real life, if you stand a mirror either side of you, your reflection goes on forever. In Cinema 4D, it won't. It will go on 5 times. So it will bounce, 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 stop. And the stop will end up with a black screen in the reflection area. To demonstrate that, I'm going to right click on my reflection depth and I'm going to go to show help. Boop. And this will, funnily enough, show exactly what I was just talking about. So this has a reflection depth of 2. So it bounces once, bounces twice. The reflection doesn't bounce a 3rd time. This time it bounces a 4th time, and there's an 8th time. Now you'll only really need to change this if, funnily enough, you set up a scene like this with lots of bouncing mirrors. Okay, so this is one of the things that you need to be aware of that will bounce, and you'll get black bits if you haven't set your reflection depth high enough. The same works for shadow depth. So if we look here in the 3rd bounce, there's no shadows, and then there is shadows and no shadows, and then there is shadows and shadows, because 2, 4, and 8. Okay, it's the same principle for working with shadows as it is to work with the reflection. So just be aware that you may need to play with those a little bit depending on the scene that you have set up. Stereoscopic, unless any of you are particularly worried about doing 3D VR stuff, you're not going to be doing that. Team render we will ignore as well. Material override is actually really useful. If you've set up your scene and you have all of the materials on it, and then you go, I really wondered what this would look like if everything was white, so I can just check the modeling. What you can do, you can create a new material. You can drag this material into here and turn on material override, and then drag it into the custom material. So it will now overwrite all of the materials in your scene with this. But what I like the fact is that you can preserve certain parts of it. So if you've got any glass in your scene, it will preserve the transparency. If you've got bump, normal, alpha, and displacement, it will preserve all of those. So you will get the textures that are being created by bumps and displacements and normal maps and things like that. But everything will be a flat white color, which is quite clever if you just want to see how your model is looking. As it notes, please note, node materials are not supported. So that's material override. Magic Bullet Looks allows you to export stuff to do with Magic Bullet Looks if you have any scenes set up or any images set up with Magic Bullet Looks, which we may have a mosey through a little bit later on. So let's create my phenomenal scene. You know me, I'm a proper 3D modeler. Oops, what have I got there? What did I create? There we go. Ta-da. And let me create something. So as you can see, I've got, hey, look at that. I was about to turn every light on. You remember when we set presets and set defaults? Oh, isn't that nice? And there I have my wonderful scene. Now, rendering, we've played with this bit a couple of times, haven't we? We pressed the first one and we pressed render and we've had a look at our scene. This renders to viewport. If you like your rendered viewport, you can actually send to picture viewer as well, and that will send it, or should send it, to the picture viewer. Ooh, have I found a bug? Ooh, I may have found a bug. Uh-oh. Can you just check if that works on yours as well while I continue? So you should be able to do that, but it's not apparently doing it right now.
Is it because you have it rendered in the viewport?
No, that's what that should do. That should send that to the picture viewer. That should send what's in the viewport to the picture viewer.
So mine does it.
Oh, okay. So it's just mine having a mare then. Fine. Okay, it's thrown me. Anyway, you can also do other things such as render selection. So if you have a cube selected and I do render selection, it will just render what I have selected. Maybe if I did the floor, that'd be a bit of a weird one. Yeah, it just renders the floor. You can also do a render region and I can say render that bit and it will just draw the bit that I've done. Or you can change that with interactive render region and I can have a little render region that we can increase in size, we can move around. And oh look, they finally changed the size of the smallest scale button in the world. This is the quality control slider. So if I bung that all the way down the bottom, you can see that we're in, well, Spectrum ZX land. There we go, we're now in PlayStation 2, PlayStation 3, PlayStation 5, there we go. It will be a bit slower as you move things around, but nonetheless, you're getting a higher quality, but it will be a bit slow to respond. So most people sort of use it in the middle to get a nice balance between quality and time. To get rid of that, just go back up here and do interactive render region again. If I want to send this to the picture viewer properly, I'll press the render to picture view button, which will do that, and then it will render it. Huzzah. So this now renders this in the picture viewer. Now, the fun thing about this bit, we will ignore all of the rest of the take stuff in here, unfortunately, for the beginners, is I've now rendered to my picture viewer. That finalizes and uses the information in my render settings window. The viewport renderer, this one, doesn't. That just is a quick preview render. As soon as you do a render to picture viewer, it initializes this information, which means if I have a look at my demo desktop, we should have dun, 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 my preview render PNG. And there it is. So it renders that out to its image when you do render to picture viewer. Now, if I created a new scene, let's use a sphere instead. I can still press render to picture viewer and it will render. This is not being saved anywhere because I have no information in my render settings for this scene. So I can still save it, however, if I want to. I can right click on the image in the picture viewer and I can do save image as. Now these images will remain in the picture viewer for as long as Cinema 4D is open. Even if I close my scene and then I go back to my picture viewer, that image is still there. If I close Cinema 4D, any unsaved image like this will disappear because they are only in a temp file for as long as Cinema 4D is open. So you'd need to right click, save image as, still image, choose your file format, click OK. It's going to ask where, desktop, preview, untitled 2, click save. And now I will have both. Okay, but there is a way of saving things out if you haven't done the saving, but rendering out properly is a good way, or well, it's a good habit to get into to make sure that you are exporting stuff properly and where it should be. The only real difference between this and using an animation is, of course, you choose, say, something like all frames, and then when it asks you to save, I'm going to choose a MOV, and let's just do a really simple animation. So, thrilling animation there. And now what I do, because I've done an output, that's the size I want, it's all the frames I want, saving, I've saved where it to go, it's going to call it preview render again, but this time it's MOV, so it won't overwrite it. Anti-aliasing is on best, so that's exactly what I want. Let's change the filter to animation just so it's a bit better. Everything else I can pretty much leave as is, and then I will press my render to picture viewer button again. Now you can see what happens is the little render buckets are going around and they are animating my scene, and I have a preview render folder and it is rendering each of the individual frames. You can see it's taking them, and I can scroll through it. I can click the last one and you can see it rendering, and then it will move to the next one and it will keep rendering, or I can click preview render. I can even click play as it's starting to as it's rendering. So it's a bit techno, but it will do it. And then once it's done, it will finalize the render and put it on my desktop.
Matt, quick question while that is happening. There's a good one that's we can talk about, I think, because we probably have different preferences for this.
Okay.
Nicholas was wondering, preference question, in which format do you usually render?
Now, you literally that was where I was about to talk. That was my next point. So that's a good job that we're all on the same wavelength. This is what I was about to say is this is fine for a short, 3-second animation that I know is not going to take very long to render. And I will render a MOV for this because it's going to give me an animation file and that's what I want it in. If you're going to render still images, then that entirely depends on what you are going to use it for. If you're layered, then you're going to need a PSD. If you want something that remembers transparency values, then you need PNGs or TIFFs. If you're going to just use something for reference, you could render as a JPEG if you want. But the big question is, okay, one thing that you can do with rendering an animation is you can render an animation out as a TIFF file. At the moment, this is just going to be a MOV file because it's an example of how to render out an animation. Why would you want to render out an animation as TIFFs? Well, what this does, I'm kind of old school. So when I used to render, machines were temperamental and they crashed a lot more than they did now. So what we used to do, we would render out an animation as a TIFF file. And it would render out individual frames, and then we would composite them and compile them together in some form of video editing software. The reason we did this is because if Cinema 4D, your computer, your power happens to crash, burn, blow up, whatever, you only lose the frame that you were rendering at the time. Whereas if you cancel, or my computer stops at frame 87 and Cinema 4D dies, my QuickTime file never finishes writing. It is truncated and therefore will not work. And so if I've been rendering for 25 hours and it dies on the last frame, I've lost everything. So depending, it's a way up between, is this going to be shortened done-time? Is this just a preview movie so I can render it as a MOV and I don't care? Versus, this is going to be a final one. I want to make sure that every render frame counts and I don't want to lose anything, so I'd render out as TIFFs. Now, it's absolutely fine if that's what you're going to do, but it is important to remember and swap it over. Because if I did this, if I changed to preview render TIFF and I click render, and I'm just going to render it quickly, there you go. So it's absolutely fine, it's rendering it. Whilst my desktop fills up with TIFF files.
We've all been there.
Which is fine if this is what you want. But it's just worth remembering. Oh, what am I doing? No, just stop the render. Stop it. Stop it. Where's the stop button? There it is.
That one,
there you
yeah.
go. Yes. So it's just worth remembering to change those. Otherwise, you may occasionally minimize and realize you've got a desktop full of stuff that you didn't want.
Yeah, so
So
I render
TIFF ones.
every animation as a, this is just my personal preference. I render everything as a PNG sequence, and I come
sequence.
and do my adjustments all in After Effects. It's just my habit.
I think it's the way a lot of people do it, to be honest. I would probably do PNG or TIFF for most of my animations, just because for that exact reason. If my machine or Cinema 4D crashes, the only thing I've lost is the frame it was rendering, not all of the work beforehand. So that's what I would do.
Yeah.
Any
other
other
good
question?
though. Vince was saying, would you do EXR for ACEs? And yeah.
You'd do an EXR file for ACEs stuff?
Yeah.
Okay.
That's the preferred format for that.
Cool.
Can you render a portion of the frame in the picture viewer?
Yes. So you can. Oh, in the picture viewer?
In the picture viewer, yeah.
No. No. You can compare and contrast, but you can't only render.
What happens
No,
if
I don't think so.
interactive render region and then send to picture viewer? That is a random guess.
Mine doesn't even do it.
Works.
I can't send anything. Well, that sends the whole viewport to the picture viewer, which is slightly weird.
That is super weird, yeah. Maybe not. I think you can Redshift, so I'll have a look later.
Okay.
We had one other quick question which came in earlier. So inside of the render settings, when you were making your adjustments, Joseph was wondering, can you set any of these to always be these different values? So for example, for like a future project, I was thinking if you could show how you could set up your own default.
Yeah. So what you can do, if you had something like this, which is your standard setup, you can actually save yourself. Oh, you can even do it differently. Oh, you can save a preset, save a difference preset, which is different from the other one. But yeah, you used to be able to save something slightly differently, didn't you? But now, because of the preset system, I suppose this is the way. This is the way. You can just save a preset, and I'll call it HD 1080. and then click OK. And therefore it will always, every new file, I can load a preset and I can go to HD 1080, and that can be the one that I use each time.
Cool, thanks.
That's all right. Anything else?
No, that's everything for now. But yeah, let us know any questions.
Okay, right. So the difference then between this and physical renderer, I mean, the settings are largely the same, but when you change to physical renderer, obviously you've got your output exactly the same as it was before. There's no difference. Saving is exactly the same as it was before. Anti-aliasing is just locked, okay? You don't get a choice about turning it on or off. It is on no matter what. You only get a choice of filter depending on what you wish to use. So that's a slight difference. And we have our little physical tab here as well. And you have a basic tab, which allows you to choose the sampling, and you can choose that, or you can choose sampling qualities, so low, medium, high, etc. Or you can go to advanced and you can choose different types of physical rendering. Now, what is the difference between standard and physical rendering? Now, I did explain this when we did materials a few weeks ago, but a few years ago, 16, the developers discovered that, obviously computers are better, the need for more advanced and realistic stuff is important, and there's a bigger demand for it. So they invented and coded the physical renderer, which is designed to be more physically accurate. So it takes into account real world things in a better way than the standard renderer does. But the standard renderer, again, still has its places for things like sketch and toon and fake stuff that a physical renderer don't physically exist. So the one thing that we need to look at, that a lot of what the physical renderer boils down to is its sampling size. Okay, it is the amount of samples that it uses to create its rendering. And under the advanced, am I missing something here? Or have they simplified it? Wherever like you choose your first pass and second pass. Oh, that's
GI.
Yeah, my brain's jumping ahead. Sorry, that's what I'm about to show you.
You're ahead of yourself.
I'm ahead of myself. I was like, hold on. No. Yeah, that's what I'm about to show you. So it's all down to kind of like sampling rates, which as you can see, so lower, medium, and higher. Of course, the higher the sampling rate, the slower your render will be. So be aware of that. It may look better, but it will take longer. Okay. One of the other things that the physical renderer does a lot better than the standard renderer are these two things up here, which is depth of field and motion blur. Okay, so motion blur is relatively simple to just kind of set up. I'm just going to put a tick in the box, and it's called motion subdivisions, and it works out the number of frames in between each frame and then merges them together. So if I'm just going to go back, I'm just going to unsave so it's not trying to overwrite anything. Yes. We're going to have to wait for it to sort of move forward a bit. But what you will see is as it starts to move, it will overlay areas. So it kind of works out the differences between even like in between frames. So can I show a nice example here? Wow, that's a lot of motion blur. But as you kind of expect, so this might be spinning. So between one frame and another frame, it's quite a small distance or a large distance. And then what this does, this blurs those images together to get that real feeling of faster movement. So it's quite a nice way of making it work. Let's see, have we got any movement yet in here that I can actually see? A little bit. So it's more of a case, it's not just fuzzing the outside, which is kind of what the old one used to do a bit. It is actually working out the in-between frames and the movements in between the in-between frames and blurring them together to give you this kind of better movement. If you look at the difference between my frame 11 here without motion blur and my frame 11 here with motion blur, you can see I'm getting that little bit of blurry movement. Okay, let's just stop that. One of the other fun things, like I said, that's really good for physical renderer, that's my preference, is depth of field. So let's create a new project and let's create something to give us depth. Dunk, dunk. Let's go to linear. I don't want it to be up. I want to be minus 250 and I want there to be lots of them. Oof, that is a lot of them. Anywho, so I'm also going to do something as well in a second, which is called geometry only, and that gets rid of a whole lot of stuff so we can see things. So in my scene, I need to make sure that I am on physical renderer. Bump. Okay, that's one of the most important things. I need to then tell physical renderer to render depth of field. Bump. Okay, if I render anything right now, it looks no different. It won't. I've told the rendering to have it, but you need to create a camera in order to use physical rendering with depth of field. So let's create a camera. Dunk. I now have a camera. It is also very important to make sure you look through the camera, otherwise you won't see the settings you're about to change. So I'm going to put a tick in this box or activate my camera. I am now looking through my camera. And what we need to do, we need to look at the physical settings here, and I need to change this. And I always change it to something crazy like 0.1 so that you can see what's going on. Nothing's changed, I hear you say. No, because by default, the viewport will not show depth of field. The renderer will. So if I just render this, very blurry. But one thing that's really nice is that as of about R18 or 19, you can here show depth of field in the viewport. So under options, depth of field, dunk. There we go, there's depth of field. Now, it's currently fielding around halfway, and that is being done by my camera's object settings under focus distance. And I can squidge that up and squidge that down, and you can see that that blurriness kind of shifts. Okay, so it's a bit much at the moment, so I'm going to go back to my physical and I'm going to call that 1, and it's a blurry at that end and not quite so much. But one thing I like to take advantage of is this focus object. So I create myself a null object. For this point, I will need to turn off geometry only, but I will turn off the work plane because that does annoy me. So under my camera, it says focus object, which means what object do you want me to focus on? Now I use the null because the null is really useful for being able to drag this forward and back, and you can see that this is blurring. I'm actually going to go to my camera, and just for you guys, just so you can see this a bit better, 0.5, you can really see where it is blurry and then where it's not, and the difference that that makes, and it allows for really nice depth of field transitional animations. So you need to make sure, as I said, you are on physical. Your physical tab has depth of field enabled. You are in a camera that you are looking through with an adjusted f-stop. Okay, and then you will get lovely depth of field stuff like this. And it's so easy to do now. It used to be a real pain, but it is now really easy. That's kind of the difference, or at least some wonderful advantages of the physical renderer over the standard renderer. So before I go and have a better look into global illumination and ambient occlusion, is there any questions?
Yeah, we have got one actually. Can you adjust the rendering tile size? So, you know, the bucket squares when it's rendering. And is there a CPU and GPU setting?
No, to the second one. Well, physical and standard renderer are CPU renderers. That's just what they do. That's what they are. That's what you're stuck with. If you want to use a GPU, you need a GPU renderer. Hello, Redshift. At least that's what obviously comes with our student thing. There are other GPU renderers are available, but not from us.
We do have to state it, don't we?
We do, yeah. But obviously Redshift is ours, so we can just state that more. But standard and physical are CPU, Redshift is GPU. As for the other one, you mentioned about bucket size. Yeah, you can change it. In physical, apparently you can't, which is interesting, but in standard you can. So you can either choose an automatic size or you can choose a different bucket size, and you can choose where they start as well. Left to right, top to bottom, centered and round. I remember when it used to be top left to right, and it used to start and it'd go down like an old typewriter.
Cool, thanks. Got a quick one as well. Can you do depth of field as a output pass? So you can then do depth of field in Photoshop.
Possibly, but I don't know the workflow. That's as far as I get on that one. Possibly you might be able to do it with a depth map, but I don't know. I've never done it.
Cool. That is
anything else?
Questions for now.
Okay. Right. So, going to another new file, let's have a better look at things like ambient occlusion and global illumination. And then after that, we can take a look at multipasses and alpha channels. So, we have explored kind of ambient occlusion and global illumination a bit when we were doing rendering and texturing and lighting, didn't we? So I won't labor this point too much. Ambient occlusion is a really useful thing. What ambient occlusion does, it works on the principle that light gets stuck in corners. Okay, and this is because light bounces into a corner like that. Light bounces in, and less light comes out than goes in. So that means that in general, corners, crevices, creases are darker. If I create my floor and I create my cube, and I render normally, I have a cube that blends in with everything else. Now, without any lights whatsoever, I'm going to go to Effect and Ambient Occlusion, and I'm going to render again. Now, that's very different. Okay, that's very different. There's a difference. I have a slight darkening around the corners where the base of the cube meets my floor. Let's just labor that point a bit. So I'm going to do my wonderful modeling. Okay, and without ambient occlusion on, very flat. With ambient occlusion on, I now have a real sense of depth and a lot more sense of reality of a real object than I had 5 seconds ago without ambient occlusion on. The thing to be aware of with ambient occlusion, what it actually does, it overlays a soft gradient from dark to, this is transparent, okay? And it does it over a distance of, it starts at 0 centimeters from a corner and ranges up 100 centimeters. So it slowly fades out from there to there. As my cube is 2 meters, it will fade out about here and then it fades out there. So it's very subtle, but it will be a difference. it's important that you remember that, because if you're ever going to do an object that is minuscule, so let's take my cube and let's make it super tiny. So it's currently 2 centimeters per digit. So let's make it 0.2, 0.2, 0.2. And let's use my placement tools to put it on the floor. And let's zoom in. And now if I render, it's super dark. This is because, of course, it's only 2 millimeters tall. So it currently gets this far in the gradient. Okay, and so it's super, super dark. I've also had people add zeros to this to see what it would do and go, why is everything rendering black? Because your ambient occlusion is overlaying everything that you've got. So it's just useful to be aware of that there is a scale factor, okay, relating to this, and that it may affect what your renders look like. Let's have a look at global illumination. Now, global illumination is super fun, because what global illumination does is it forces Cinema 4D to figure out how light actually bounces. Now, I did cover this a few weeks ago, so I really won't go into this that much this time. But what it allows you to do, it allows you to create materials that have a luminance value that you apply to objects. And if I render this right now, it looks just like a white dot on a grey background. But the moment I turn on global illumination, Cinema 4D has to work out photon bounce, which is what this is, all these little bouncy photons, and then I have light emitting from a luminant disk, and it sends stuff out. Okay, this, as mentioned earlier, is where you can choose your primary and secondary methods of dispersion. Now, there is differences in them, and supposedly the best one in the world is primary and secondary of quasi Monte Carlo. Who names these things? I haven't the faintest. You can see a difference in time and how long this is taking to render. What, to be honest, will effectively look exactly the same. If you're really interested in the different things, go to show help and have a look at what primary and secondary does. So you can see primary methods only, and the difference between primaries and secondaries. It's like a secondary light bounce where it's figuring out where everything is going. The most precise, but the slowest with quasi Monte Carlo. There used to be an article in here, which I thought was really useful, which had a scene that was rendered through every single one of the possible permutations of the different things. And the quasi Monte Carlo took like 12 hours and the light maps took 7 minutes, and the difference was negligible. So it's just something to be aware of. You can see that stopped now. But nonetheless, it is really useful for getting more realistic light bounces and illuminating scenes.
Matt, really quickly, could you show again inside the render settings how you can add ambient occlusion and global illumination?
I can. So inside your render settings, you have an effect bar, and I can choose to add ambient occlusion. I can't add global illumination again because it's already there. So let me select that and press delete. And I go to effect and I can add ambient occlusion or global illumination. So that's just there.
Cool, thank you.
That's right. Is there anything else I need to cover with global illumination? Really, that's kind of it.
That's kind of it. We went through it in quite a bit of detail in the
Last time.
3 for lighting. Yeah.
Right. In which, didn't we do multipasses last time as well? Did I? Or am I making that up? I'm sorry, it wasn't long ago that I did that. So let's have a look at multipasses. Sorry?
I don't remember.
No, I don't. Anyway, let's do multipasses and alpha channels. So multipasses require some form of scene setup, of course. I definitely did this. I don't know. So I've got my wonderful scene set up, and once again, I'm going to create my light. I'm just going to move it over there. So I have my beautiful scene. You can tell I take a lot of time and care over ensuring that these are correct. And what we do in our render settings, we have output as we did before, and I'm going to choose the size that I want. So let me actually let's do this. Let's go to my preset and say this one. Dunk. So that loads all of that in, although it's about to do an animation, which I don't want. So I want manual, or I want current frame only. I've got to tick the box to make sure that it actually does it as well. Save. I'm going to untick. Okay, now people can choose to have that, but I'm going to turn that off. In multipass, I'm going to put a tick though. So this now says I'm going to use multipasses. What this does, this will allow you to separate the files and the layers inside Cinema 4D as render. Separate lights here is currently set to none, which means it will move all of the things together. All means it will separate all of the individual lights into different folders, or just the ones that you have selected. So none or all at the moment won't make any difference, except the fact that I need to have all, otherwise it won't separate it out. Then you can choose the 3 channels that you want to separate it out into. Now, by default, it chooses the 3 channels. So you'll get diffuse, which is the color, specular, which is the light bounce, and then shadow. I also recommend putting the shadow correction on as well, because it softens any issues around shadowing around the box. In here, you can choose 2 channels, diffuse and specular, as 1 channel and shadow as another, or 1 channel, which is the same as not doing a multipass at all, because you've still got 1 image. So I'm going to stick with the 3 channels here. Okay, and then I'm going to go back to my save, and you can see that I've now got 2 areas. I've got multipass image and regular image, which I've already unticked. I'm just going to minimize that to get rid of it, because I'm going to ignore it. Some people do use that because they call it a beauty pass. So you can see what the original render looked like before you started messing around with all of the layers in Photoshop and or your compositing program of choice. Now, the format is automatically a layered format, so it's already gone to PSD for me, thank you very much. And just before, I need to choose somewhere for it to go, so we will call it multipass. Dunk. And that will now do a rendered multipass image. Let me just check my settings. Yes, 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 yes. Current frame, thank you. Save PSD. Multipass is going to do the 3 lights. Anti-aliasing is already best. Let's turn that to a still image. And now I'm going to press my render to picture view button, which renders this out. Now there is I've got lots of stuff in here already from earlier, so I'm just going to minimize some things. Ooh, there we go. So my multipass render is here, and here is my sphere. Now it looks at the moment just like a standard image. Ooh. But what I'm going to do, if I go to my layers section, you can see that I now have a folder called light. And if I open that up, I've got 3 things in here. I've got the light shadow, light specular, light diffuse. That's because the name of my light is called light. If I called that Bob, then this would say Bob shadow, Bob specular, Bob diffuse. I can go to single pass, which means I can look at the individual single passes like this, which make up my final image, or I can go to multipass, and then I can turn off the shadow if I particularly want to. I can turn off the specular so that I'm not getting that bounce back. I can turn off the diffuse, which is very bizarre. Okay, so I've got the choice of looking through all of those, and this is exactly the file that I would have had created on my desktop as a PSD, which I could then load in Photoshop, which I'm not going to do right now because it will take forever. So that is multipassing, which is incredibly useful for being able to move stuff around and manipulate the image and tweak levels of things. Because you can also, if I go to my multipass section here, you are able to choose any of these as a different layer as well. So if I had ambient occlusion on my setting, actually, should we do that? Let's turn on ambient occlusion, and then I'm going to go to my multipass and I'm going to add an ambient occlusion channel. And then I'm going to go to my other file with the cube in it, and I'm going to drag and get my cube, move it to my other file, delete my sphere, make my cube not 0.2 anymore. Oh, what am I doing? Move that up, boom. So now if I render, ta-da, it's going to say, do you want to overwrite that? Yeah, let's overwrite it. So now I have that, and I have an ambient occlusion pass as well, which I can turn on and off. So my Photoshop file will now have an ambient occlusion pass. And if there was reflection and refraction and all of those sorts of other things and transparencies that you have in the materials, you would be able to separate each of those out inside of my multipass simply by going to multipass and then choosing materials, things like that, post effects, global illuminations. I can even have as a separate one, caustics for light bounces. You know, you can separate each one of these out and then use them as different layers. I'm going to just quickly go over alpha channels super fast, and then we'll see if there are any questions. So there are two ways of doing alpha channels depending on what you've got. If I've got a very simple scene with no background, what I can do in my render settings, I can go to save regular image and I can choose an alpha channel. And then I'd need to make sure I have a file format that understands alphas. So if I just do that, let's call this desktop, let's call that alpha. Boom. All I've done is choose alpha channel. Okay, so I've got my outputs, I'm not changing anything else, save alpha channel. And now if I render to picture viewer, that looks exactly the same, but I've got an alpha channel. Okay, and if I look at my desktop, I have my TIFF that actually has a blank background because the alpha is embedded, so it's already removed it. Okay, so that's really useful for adding alphas in super fast, but it only works, of course, if you don't have anything in the background. If I have something in the background, like, shall we say, a floor, and I do the same thing, my alpha doesn't know what to take away because as far as it thinks, there is something all the way around. So it only works for kind of individual or groups of objects as long as you don't have a background. But what if you want to take away something like this cube? Then there's another way. So with this cube, I want to be able to cut it out, but I've got a floor. So with my cube selected, I'm going to go to object. No, I'm not. I'm going to go tags. I'm going to go to render tags. I'm going to go to compositing. And under my object buffer tab, which is this one, I'm going to enable object buffer number 1. So this is now understanding that this is object buffer number 1. In my settings here, with my multipass that I have all set up, I go to multipass, and here I have something called object buffer. I'm going to click that, and that says, what object buffer, what layer, what number group ID do you want me to separate out as an alpha channel? Or a black and white mask at the very least. And so I'm going to choose group number 1, and I'm going to render again, constantly overwriting my poor Photoshop file. So not only do I have an ambient occlusion layer now, which I can turn on and off, but I now have an object buffer mask, which I can use to separate that object out from inside of something like Photoshop. And that, see, as you can see, I can, using the mask, I can cut that out, even in the picture viewer, which I think is super helpful. And that is ambient occlusion, global illumination, render settings, multipasses, and alpha channels. Any questions?
So there was actually one, but I think what you just showed exactly answered that question. It was about
Huzzah!
alpha channels being created for Photoshop with transparent areas.
Yeah,
How
that pretty
you
much did
create
it.
an extra alpha channel for one or more objects in order to release them. For example, if a chair is on a floor and you need the chair to be cut out, I imagine that's
That,
the exact thing, right?
that is exactly how.
Perfect. Cool. Garrick was actually just also saying inside the multi-passes area, that's where you would add your depth pass for like compositing. What about
It's
putting
down there.
objects on separate passes? For instance, render characters separate from the background or render multiple shaders on the object using passes. So is there a way of setting like an object ID per pass so you could render out certain elements on one pass and then background elements on another? Like in Redshift, you can
Uh,
set up an object ID AOV, and so then you'd set some objects as one object ID and some as the other, and then they'll be on separate passes.
yes, but you're only cutting stuff out. There's nothing behind it. So you would just, if you were to have a character wandering around that you wanted to be on one layer and a background to be on another, then you would just set up different group IDs and you would be able to take one away from the other, in theory. Yes.
Cool.
If that's what you mean.
I think so. If not,
Okay.
Vince, let us know.
Yeah.
Does alpha work for shadows?
No. Well, technically I've got a shadow layer, so I would have to move that around. So if I'm gonna have to load Photoshop, aren't I? Nearly there. There we go. So I have an ambient occlusion layer which I can turn on and off, and I actually have a separate shadow layer. Under my channels, I have an object buffer, so I can only cut out the object. It doesn't allow me to move. It doesn't relate to the shadow in any way. So I would need to move a shadow around because it relates to a whole object. So if I did that, it would be in a completely different place to everything else now and won't comp together properly. Well, that's trippy. So if I was to cut out the cube, it cuts out the object, not its shadow.
Okay, cool. Thanks for showing that. That's handy.
That's all right.
Can you export each multipass as a separate sequence?
If you were to do an animation and you were to do that, it would it? Oh, I can't remember.
I've never done it.
Let's see what happens. I have done it and I can't remember whether or not it will automatically. If I do a MOV, it will definitely do individual MOV files for each layer.
Okay, but if we're talking like PNG sequence, is it going to do one?
I'm doing a PSD, so I'm doing a multi-layered file which would have all of them in. I think if I did PNG, that disables, and then I would get a image sequence for each one. So let's just do a frame or two and see what happens. Yeah, I'm getting individuals. So I've got the multipass AO, multipass light specular, and that. I've only done one frame of my animation, but nonetheless, it's separated them all out as individual sequences. So yes, if you had an animation, they would all have their own individual sequences.
Cool. When you were doing the object buffer, Rick was wondering where the buffer tag is.
That is under tags, rendering tags, compositing. It's a compositing tag, and it's one of the tabs of the tag.
Great. We have a it depends question. Time-wise,
Ooh.
which render settings would you advise?
It
It really
depends.
depends what you're doing
Yeah,
and how and what
there's
kind of quality you want as well.
yeah, there's no answer to that covers everyone. It's just not possible. You know, are you rendering for cartoon, in which case your render settings would be completely differently? Are you rendering for photorealistic render to go out somewhere, then you know you would render differently. Are you rendering an animation for comping together visual effect shots, in which case they would all be different again. So that there's no answer to that covers anyone together.
You can find like a balance by knowing what will increase render times, but
Yeah.
often these things are also increasing quality. So things like when Matt showed anti-aliasing, you put it on best. If you find you can lower your threshold, your error threshold, to get a nicer quality render, but of course that will then
Take longer.
take longer. So you could find where it gets to the point where you can't really see that much of a difference. So like 10% might still be a bit high. You could probably drop it to like 5, maybe even 2, and it won't go crazy. Things like adding global illumination and ambient occlusion will all add to render times as well, as will things like textures. So textures is kind of like the other half of talking about rendering. If you have a lot of reflection going on, if you have some like 4K or 8K texture images on to do like imperfections, all of that is then going to take longer to render as well. Transparency is a killer. So it's a lot of just kind of tweaking until you are satisfied. And also depends
Yeah,
when
pretty
your
much.
deadline is.
Yes, that's the other thing. It isn't it? It's just like, how much time have I got versus how good do I want it to look?
Yeah, for me, I just put nice render settings and let it render overnight. So I do
I
sometimes. And yeah, hardware, as Sassy was saying, is a big thing as well. So dependent on your machine will depend on the speed.
Yeah.
Cool. We have a couple of other quick questions. I'm not really sure about this one. So Keyshot has something called a clown pass. Is there something similar in Cinema 4D? Clown pass is used in Photoshop for a quick selection of objects and materials.
I haven't the faintest idea.
No, wasn't sure if you'd know anything like
I've
that.
never heard of that, so I don't know.
Sorry, we do not know. Do HDRIs mess with alphas, or does the alpha just ignore it?
Do you know the answer to that offhand?
I don't.
No, neither do I. I think as it's a sky object, in theory, it should basically go, no, because it is a sky, not a light. So this is going to be a difference between using your renderer. If you're going to use standard or physical, in theory, I'm about to test this. If you have, what am I doing? I don't want a material, I want the other side. I'll finish my sentence. In theory, if you have an HDR, in Cinema 4D, you require an HDR to be on a sky. So the sky is an object. So if you have an alpha, it's going to not like it because, oh, it does. Maybe it is clever enough to do that. So if I go to my, oh, it's because of, oh no, it is. It's even done it with the alpha as well as the object buffer. I'm going to turn off object buffer and just do the straight alpha. It ignores the sky object. Well, isn't that helpful? Cool. Yeah, that answers that question. It ignores the sky object. I'm just going to try and doing a completely new one. So I've got nothing else interfering with this other than alpha channel. Yep, there it is. Superb. Ignores the alpha channel. It ignores the HDRI, or at least the background, which is cool.
Cool. Thanks for showing it.
That's right, no worries.
Yeah, I think those are the questions for now.
Woo!
So. But yeah, any other questions, then feel free to, drop them in the chat and we'll do our best to answer them.
Cool. Right, shall I throw the presentation at you then?
Yes, let's do it.
I mean, we could go for, like I say, we've always done, I do the theory and then you do the practical. So we could do the practical, which is basically you pressing render and us watching it for an hour. Which is kind of the practicality of rendering, isn't it?
Don't ruin the surprise. Also, someone's asked the cat's name.
This is Kai.
There we go, most important question of the day. Right, cool. Can you see my screen?
We can.
Cool, right. So, yeah, so I wanted to get into showing some color workflows, and we can kind of, it kind of goes nicely with rendering. And I'll also show a couple of bits inside of Redshift as well. So if people have any Redshift questions, then just let me know. So we're going to look at MoGraph Colour to start with. This was brought up last week, and we suggested that we would kind of show it in this week. So what I'm going to do, I'm just going to set up like a super simple MoGraph scene, just because the idea is to show you guys more about the color workflow more than the actual MoGraph workflow. So for the sake of this, I'm just going to grab a cube and I'm just going to shift click X, Y, and Z. And I'm going to just enter a value of 20. And before I hit enter, I'm going to press Control and then press enter. And it's going to change all of those values I highlighted to the same number. So a little tip on a quick way of doing that if you guys didn't already know. Cool, so what I'm going to do, I'm going to set up just sort of like a grid of these cubes. And I'm going to do that using the cloner. So I'm going to drop my cube into my cloner, and just for this, I'm going to change my mode to endpoint, and I'm going 20 by 1 by 20. So we have a nice grid of cloned cubes going on. And then what I'm going to do, I'm going to grab myself a plane effector. I'm going to remove my position, and I'm just going to switch on some uniform scale, and then we'll go like minus 0.5. And then the only other thing I need to do for this setup is I'm going to grab a torus field. So let's have a little look, see what's going on here. And so already we can see we have a bit of a color kind of change going on. So our cubes that aren't being affected are white, and our cubes that are being fully affected by our plane effector are green. And then we have like this gradient in between of the ones that are kind of, they're not quite fully scaled down to minus 0.5, but they're not quite at their normal 100% size. So we have a gradient. So this isn't necessarily MoGraph color. This is actually the color remapping of our field. In order to use MoGraph Colour, and we're talking standard Cinema 4D for now, but the setup is the same, but the material will be different. We need to come into our parameter, and under colour, so we're in our plane effector, under parameter, we have a colour option, and our colour mode is set to fields colour, which is why it's looking at that colour remap of our torus field. But we actually want it to be changed to custom colour, And then I'm going to just change this color just to black. And so now we have the same thing going on, but we have a white to black gradient. And now we've made this change to custom color, we can now set up a custom gradient inside of our Cinema 4D material. So let me just, so for the sake of this, I'm just going to add a sky, and I'm just going to press Option R, and that's going to give me my interactive render region. And because I haven't really got any advanced render settings going on, I'm just going to pull my slider all the way to the top, and it's still going to be nice and super fast. So as we can see inside of my interactive render region, I can still see this gradient going on. However, if I open up my material manager, I'm just going to create a normal standard material. So I'm just going to double click. If I drop this material on my cloner, the color disappears. So we're no longer getting that gradient, even though we've set this up inside of our plane effector. And this is because we need to set up our MoGraph Colour inside of our material or our texture. So what we can do, we can double click our material. And for the sakes of this and for the sake of speed, I'm just going to do everything in the color channel for now, just so I can demonstrate how you set this up. So inside my color channel, we have a texture drop down. And this is where we can do things like loading images, loading a gradient, loading like noise, loads of different stuff. But the one we want to go for is right at the bottom, we have a MoGraph option. And in here, we have a color shader. So if I select color shader, we now have our gradient back. But what if we want to change this gradient? So, you know, we don't really want this black to white. We want something a bit more kind of interesting. So if I click my color shader, oh, we don't really have any options in here. So what we need to do, we need to come back, and on this same texture drop down, so once we've selected our color shader, we then want to drop this down, and a colorizer allows us to colorize pretty much any layer inside of our material. So if I select my colorizer, and then if I click my little thumbnail preview, you can see we now have our shader properties, which is our color shader. And now we have a gradient and a black and white gradient. And it's this gradient that we can now update and change to adjust our MoGraph color. So if we just, I don't know, do some different colors in here, change these two like handles just to something maybe like this. Now what's happening is our material is taking the MoGraph information and it is applying this gradient to it. So we can see everything that isn't being affected by our plane effector is this pink color and is also this kind of, it's full size. Everything that is then being affected by our plane effector, and so therefore is scaling down by a value of minus 0.5%, is then this blue color. And then you can kind of see in here, we then get a gradient of the colors, which this little one here is sort of like a purple color because it's not quite the small cube, but it's not quite the full size cube either. And so this is how we would adjust this in here. And then it's going to copy it's going to update based on your changes. So if we come into our field and we kind of increase like our thickness, we can see that our color is going to update straight away. And we can even use this same technique if we switch off things like scale, we can use it to just change the color of certain things as well. So we can move around our field, and now our field is defining where this color is happening. So let me just, here we go. Right, so let me switch off my interactive render region and let me show you guys how you can do this same thing inside of Redshift. So in case we have any people here watching that want to know how to do it in Redshift. So I'm actually going to just copy this whole setup just to save me having to make it again. And I'm going to go to a new scene, I'm going to paste it, and I'm just going to sort of delete this texture. Okay, so let's do the same thing we did, but now in Redshift. So the first thing I did was I added a sky inside of my standard Cinema 4D scene. What I'm going to do a similar thing, but I'm going to use the equivalent light inside of Redshift. And the equivalent light to the sky is, if we come up to our Redshift tab, this is where we can find all of the things we could possibly need for Redshift. So objects, lights, cameras, and material options. Under lights, we have something called a dome light. And if we add a dome light, this is going to give us like an all over light, similar to how the sky does inside of like standard Cinema 4D. And it also allows us to add a HDR image inside of it. So if we have a look at our dome light, we have this texture option. And in here, if you're using Redshift and you want a light with a HDR image, this is where you would load it into. So we might even do that a little bit later on. So inside my render settings, oh yeah.
Quick question.
Yeah.
Gareth is asking, is it important that you set the field color to black?
It needs to be a different color. It doesn't need to be black.
Okay.
Just needs to be a different
Thank
color.
you.
But yeah, once you add the colorizer, it will change it anyway. So it's, as long as it's a different color so you can visually see it, then
Right, okay.
yeah, it doesn't have to be. But because when you switch it on straight away, it goes to white. So yeah, I'd recommend changing that.
Cool. Thank you.
Cool, no worries. Yeah, so inside my render settings, really quickly, for the sake of this, I'm just going to change my renderer to Redshift, but I'm not going to worry about changing anything else. Cool, so how do we use like the equivalent of the render region inside of here, but for Redshift? There's two different ways of doing that, and it's genuinely personal preference. So if you want your viewport to turn into your IPR, which is your interactive progressive renderer, you can come up to Redshift and you can go to Start IPR. We kick this off. We can now see that our viewport has turned into our IPR, and we can move things around. And we're seeing a slightly pixelated version of, you know, what our final render would eventually look like. The only thing I'm going to do quickly is in my dome light, I don't actually want to see this. I don't want to see this kind of like white light, so I can actually turn off my background like how we hid our HDRI in compositing inside of Cinema 4D. So I'll just switch that off, and now we can see this. Cool, so I'm going to stop my IPR to bring my normal viewport back. The other way, and the way that I like to work, is I like to have my viewport and my render view side by side. It's just a personal preference. So the way that we can do that is up in the Redshift bar at the top. If we drop it down, we have a Redshift render view. And if I just open this up, we then get a separate window, which is our Redshift render view. And if we play it, we can just press this button here. And then now we have the same thing, but we have a separate window. And I do find it is a much more true representation to what your final render is going to be like. We can even dock it. So, you know, we can pause this. We can grab these three, I believe it's called the hamburger, right? We can actually dock it, and then we can work side by side if we want to.
I'm not sure it's the official name, but it is definitely now becoming known as the hamburger, isn't it?
Absolutely. Well, I think I've heard you say it once, and now I say it.
Yeah, sorry.
Cool, right. So how do we now set up our texture and inside of Redshift and use that same kind of MoGraph Colour workflow? So I'm just going to kick off my render view, and I'm just going to leave it here so we can see everything update live. So again, we can see our gradient happening, but when we apply a material to it, it's going to disappear the same way as it did inside of the standard materials. So we're going to create a material, we're going to create a Redshift material. So we're going to come to our create inside of our material manager, and then we're going to come to Redshift, and we just want to grab a standard material. And this is going to open up a Redshift material inside of our material manager. Let me just pause that for now. So if we open this up, slightly different to the Cinema 4D material manager, this is the Redshift shader graph, and people who don't use Redshift materials are created using nodes. So it's a node-based material setup.
What is this dark magic?
And I mean, it does seem daunting, but really the way to kind of have a look at the two, if we look at the two side by side, there are a lot of things that do kind of directly translate over. So when we open up a Redshift material and we open up our shader graph, we get two nodes. We have our output, which is going to be the output on the surface of our texture. And we have, to start with, a Redshift material node. And this is just our material that we're going to create. And so if we look at a comparison, so let me just pull this over so we can see it's a bit clearer. So inside of my base properties, I have a diffuse color. And this literally is just the color of my texture. So I can change that the same as I can change my color inside of my material in here. We then have our reflection, which is like our reflectance area here. You know, we have our BRDF, which is like Beckman and GGX, the same as we have up inside of here. We have Fresnel and IOR, and sheen is a bit of like a fake Fresnel. And then we also have refraction, which is our transparency. And so this, inside of this Redshift material node alone, we can make a lot of the same changes that we can inside of our Cinema 4D material. The only difference is if you then want to do additional things, for example, like bump or displacement, you just have to find a node. So the way to think of how nodes work is whatever you want to do, you just need to find a node for it normally. So that was just a quick little comparison of the two. And what I'm going to do, I'm just going to right click and set that to default. And now let's look at actually kind of doing some MoGraph Colour with this. So I'm going to drop my Redshift material on my cloner and I'm going to kick off my render view and everything's going to go grey. So now how do we bring back that MoGraph Colour? So the way that we do that is we use something called a Colour User Data node. And so that is in here. And this color user data node, what we want to do, we want this to be controlling my diffuse color. And so all I need to do is plug it into my Redshift material node, and it's going to say, okay, what input do you want it to be controlling? And we want it to control our diffuse color. So I'm going to select diffuse color, and everything's going to go black because by default it's set to black. But all we need to do is drop this down. Then we have a MoGraph option, and then we can select MoGraph Colour. And then now we've brought back our MoGraph Colour inside of our Redshift shader graph. So now how do we kind of colorize this like we did inside of the standard material? Well, we can do that with the same kind of gradient, only this time it's called a ramp, and it's a ramp node. So we're going to grab our ramp node, and we need to put this in between our MoGraph Colour user data and our diffuse color. So we're going to plug our MoGraph Colour information into our ramp input, and then our ramp input goes into our diffuse. And then the same as we just changed the colorizer little knots, we can just update these so we can find sort of similarish colors. And now this is controlling and using the MoGraph information to colorize this setup. And then we can do the same thing. We can come into our torus and we can, we can up this. We can move this around and it's all going to update inside of this same texture. And if we want to change our gradient, all we do is come into here and, we make some changes. So that's a quick look at how to set up MoGraph Colour in both a standard Cinema 4D sense. So if you're using standard Cinema 4D renderer, you would set it up in the first way using the normal materials. Or if you're using Redshift, this is how you set it up using the Colour User Data node. Any questions before we get into doing a similar thing but with Vertex Map Colour?
Just one, but it's slightly different. Well, so a Redshift question, then we'll come to the other one. Does Redshift use mix nodes?
Sort of. So is mix node sort of like the octane mix material? If so, kind of. So if we come into, let me just create a new Redshift material. What you can do, do you know what, we're kind of doing this next. What you can do
Okay.
is, so you would have your one material, so your RS material. Let's say we're like, okay, I want it to be a red material. And then you would have, I'm just going to do it with 2 textures. Sometimes you can do it with multiple, or in a lot of cases you can do it with multiple. I would then set up, let's say, my second material by grabbing another material node. And for example, I'd want this one to be, I don't know, like blue, just to be stereotypical, red and blue. Then the equivalent inside of Redshift, if it's the same kind of thing, is the material blender. And so if we look at the material blender, it basically asks for the different layers, which are your different materials. So I would plug my red material into my base color, plug that into my output. And then my blue material becomes my layer color 1, which is therefore my second texture. And then we have a blend color option. So dependent on how you want to mix your textures, you will put like a black and white mask inside of this blend color. And this is something we're going to do in a sec when we look at vertex maps. So we're going to use our vertex map inside of our blending mask, and it's going to blend between these 2 colors. Hopefully that is, if it's the same as Octane Mix, I think that is the similar workflow inside of Redshift.
Yep, that's it. Like mixed, diffuse, and transparent is what Daniel has said. So thank you very much.
Cool. Did you say there was another one, or shall I?
There is, but I've kind of answered it. So someone's asked, how can I create a flickering effect within Cinema 4D and Redshift, you know, that appears on hot asphalt or above a candle? So basically heat haze. But I've said, I think that's probably more of a video compositing effect that you would put in rather than something I think that is possible to animate or render inside of Cinema.
Yeah, I suppose you could maybe do it with like fog type stuff.
Yeah, it's light bending, things like that. So it's not something Cinema's really ever been designed to do.
Oh,
But other than that, no, it was just the mix ones. So I'll let you carry on. Thank you.
cool. Cool. Right. So now I'm going to show you how you would kind of set up your vertex map. We're going to do, which is something we did last week anyway. So we're going to kind of like rush through that, but then we're going to take that vertex map and we're going to use it to control the change of textures inside of Cinema 4D, and then we're going to look at inside of Redshift, which uses that blending workflow. So really quickly, we're just going to set something up super fast. I'm going to write the words color, and I'm sure a lot of you are going to be shouting, saying I'm spelling it wrong. And I'm just going to use any old font. What should we go with? I quite like this one. And I'm going to align it to the middle. Okay, cool. Right. So as we know, when we're setting up our vertex map, subdivisions are super important because it's going to grow dependent on the subdivisions and the points on top of our text. So if we come into our caps, let's just for the sake of this, add some nice rounding. And then in order to set up our subdivisions, there's 3 different parameters we need to change. The first one is our caps type. We need to adjust this and change it to regular grid. So now we can see we have a bit more of like a regular grid going on. And if we just drop this down, we can enable quad dominant and then just kind of reduce this size dependent on the amount of subdivisions that you're after. For the sake of this demo, I'm just going to leave it on 6. Then back in object, the other thing we need to change are our intermediate points on our text spline. So at the moment they're adaptive, which is why on these flat areas we have no subdivision, and on these curved areas we have more. We actually want more of an all over subdivision. So if we just change this to subdivided, we get a lot more of an even subdivision, and we can even adjust our angle to something like 90 to have it a bit more uniform. And the final thing is the subdivisions on our depth, which is this value here. Let me just maybe put this on 5. Cool, so now we have a much denser mesh, and this is going to help when it comes to, let me just make this a bit more bold. There we go, that's a bit better. And it's going to help us when it comes to setting up our vertex map. So once this is done, I'm just going to copy this text over just by habit, and I'm going to make this original one editable. So I'm going to hit the C key, or you can press this little button down here. I'm going to hit the C key, and then it actually separates everything into nulls and extrude generators. So for the sake of this, I'm just going to right click, and I'm going to go to connect object and delete. So it's one solid object. I don't want separate individual ones. So once this is done, we can actually set up our vertex map, and I'm just going to really quickly set up a growth based on a point that kind of comes across, and it's a similar growth that we set up, I think it was last week when we looked at setting up a vertex map mixed with MoGraph, and we grew the grass along it. So the important thing here is you've got to be in points mode, and I'm just going to grab a random point on the left hand side. And then we just need to set up our vertex map. So we can do that by coming down to set vertex weight, and then it's asking us what vertex weight does it want this point to be. And we want it to be a value of 100%. So it has 100% vertex weight value, and everything else has a value of 0, which is why it's gone red. We now have our vertex map tag on our text. And to create the growth, we need to come into our basic tab, and then we need to use fields. So we're going to enable use fields, and then in our fields menu, by default, it creates this freeze modifier layer, and this is the exact layer that we need to create a growth. All we have to do is on the mode, change it to grow, and now we can see our orange area's got a bit bigger. So as I press play, it's going to just grow over. However, it's not going to jump to the next letter. We have to increase our radius to do so. And so I know a value of 26 is going to jump all the way across. Cool. Right, so we rush through this because the more important thing is to look at how we can use this vertex map inside of our color. Let me just reduce my effect strength, and let me just play it until we've got about halfway across. Okay, cool. Right, so I'm going to switch on my interactive render region. I'm just going to see this so we can actually see exactly what's happening. And I'm going to create a standard Cinema 4D material, and I'm going to drop this on my text. Cool, so now how do we use our vertex map within this material? So in our color channel, we're going to drop down our texture again. And then all we want to do is under effects, all the way to the bottom, we have a vertex map. And if we click this, we have an area where we can actually load in a vertex map to use for this material. So I'm going to drag and drop my vertex map in. And then we can already see we've got a bit of a sort of effect going on. And we just want to do the same thing. We're going to drop this down, and we're going to go colorizer. And then in here, similar to how we did the MoGraph one, we just need to change these colors. And then now, if we play this through, see, we don't even need the interactive render region. It's going to do it in the viewport. Now our vertex map growth is directly being controlled, or our color is directly being controlled by our vertex map growth. And so obviously this isn't super interesting because we just have a bit of like a standard vertex map growth going on. But if you had a really like kind of advanced vertex setup, you could make a really cool sort of like growth effect coming across. Let's do the same thing in Redshift. So in here, we're going to remove this texture, and let's have a look at this. So one thing I do notice when you copy and paste something with a vertex map over, it doesn't always work very well. So we can see here now, if we go to the front of my timeline, it doesn't really like it. So let's just quickly set this up again. Oh no, wrong button. Set vertex weight, 100%. And then we know the exact same setup, use fields, mode to grow. So basically just resetting this vertex map up. Now just press play. Cool. Right, so let's now do it in Redshift. First things first, I'm going to change my renderer to Redshift. And then I'm just going to add a dome light. Cool. Right, let's kick off our render view so we can see what's going on. So this is what we have at the moment. Nothing special. So we're going to create a standard Redshift material again. So similar to how we did for the Redshift MoGraph color workflow. I'm going to drop this onto our text. And let's open up our shader graph. Okay, so this first texture, so let's say we're going to do like a glossy black to gold based on our vertex map. So we have to set up both of those textures first. So our first texture is going to be a kind of a just off 100% black. And then we can set up a gold really easily inside of Redshift. So we've grabbed another material node. So this is going to be our second material. We're going to plug that into our surface just so we can see what it looks like. So we've got a nice preview here. And inside of Redshift, inside of the standard material node, we have a couple of different preset options. So, you know, we have things like water and stuff like that. And one of them is gold. I'm just going to up the roughness of this gold a little bit. Cool, so we have our glossy black and then we have our gold. And this is where we can take advantage of that mix or that blending workflow that we just had a look at. So if I grab my material blender, my black is going to be my base color. So I'm just going to plug this in and it's going to be my base color. And we're going to plug that into our surface. And so we can now see we have that all over glossy black. Then my gold is going to be my second layer, which is going to be this layer color one. And then now we need to use the vertex map as our blending mask. And the way that we do that inside of Redshift is using something called a vertex attribute node. So the vertex kind of gives away that this is a node that you might need. And we're going to plug this into our blend color one. And then inside of here, it's asking for the attribute. And this is just where we need to drop in our vertex map. So similar to how we did in the Cinema 4D standard material, we just need to drop in our vertex map. And then now we can see, as we play this through, our vertex map is controlling this kind of blend between our two textures.
That's cool.
Yes.
I have a question. Well, Anders has a question.
Okay.
He said, can you make an object blurry or semi-transparent using the vertex map technique? Transparent, I would say yes, because you could, in theory, put the vertex map in the alpha channel of something, or
So
not
wait,
even
transparent or
gone?
dissipated?
That's a very good question. Yeah.
Those are two very different things. Both possible.
Yeah. Yeah, you could do it in the alpha channel. That would just make it disappear. If you wanted it to be kind of transparency like glass, you'd just put it in a different channel, wouldn't you?
Well, if you are looking at, so the vertex map is controlling the transparency.
Yeah, although he's just put in, thinking about it, it's really a question about creating a blurry, a blurry material and then using the vertex map to apply it. So as I imagine if you did this the other way around, so you had a gold material and a transparent material, you would then use a vertex map to control the alpha between one and the other. So in theory, that is exactly the same as what Elly's just done, except you would use two different materials. That makes more sense. So that it kind of disappears, in which case you could do it with alpha. There are many different ways. Daniel has asked, can you do the same blending using noise texture? So is that you use a noise rather than a vertex map? Is that Daniel?
Yeah, so as in, so we're talking not using a vertex map at all, but blending between the two textures based on a noise.
I would have thought so, because then you just have black and shiny gold bits everywhere, wouldn't you?
Then absolutely, yes, you
Rather
can.
than a vertex map, yes.
So
Yeah,
if
so
we go
you
to our
just delete
vertex
the
map,
vertex map.
all we have to do is we can, let's just get a noise. So we can use a Maxon noise. And so we can even see what it looks like on our surface. So maybe we want to kind of scale it up a little bit. And then maybe we want to increase our contrast a little bit. And now what we can do is we can use this Maxon noise as our blending mask.
Woo! That's cool. I like that.
So yes, that is, if that's what they had in mind, then absolutely you can use any basically any kind of grayscale texture in there to create this kind of effect.
Yeah, I've got a fun one for you.
Oh, go on.
Can you also manipulate the color via the camera angle, as with specialist car paintwork? You know, like the pearlescent stuff, which is colored at some angles and not to others. In theory, that is possible. And all you actually need to do that, now I can do it in normal cinema.
Yes,
I
I
don't
think
know
you can do
about
it in
Redshift.
Redshift. Do you want to do it in
Oh,
normal while I figure out how to do it in Redshift? Because I'm so sure it's possible.
it's just a Fresnel shader. It's a Fresnel and it's just at one color at one end and one at the other,
Yeah.
I think. Iridescent, thank you, Rick. That was the word I was after. Yeah, color shifting. Because I've actually made one before. When we went to Vertex and we did that event, and I was entertaining people with all of those ugly different colors of Ferrari that I had on my screen. A couple
Yeah.
of them were the iridescent ones. Let me see. You try and set it up there. I'll try and set mine up here.
I think oh God, I've done it in Redshift. Oh God.
I mean, technically, we've got car paint materials as well in there somewhere.
Oh, hang on. State node. Everyone's just going to be watching me like try and figure this out now. So state node, drop you on there. You need to be in my diffuse color, and then vector something, vector change range. God, it's one way or another. It's either state then vector or vector then state. State, we're going to find out. No, it doesn't like that. Let me find with a different object. Something might be a bit more interesting, like a sphere. There definitely is a way. Oh, have I done it?
I have.
I'm trying to, I need a change of colors inside of here. Why are you not giving me enough change?
Yep, I've done it.
Do you want to take the screen? Because I'm
Yeah.
so sure there is a way.
Oh, if go to webinar would appear. Thank you. Do you have a Fresnel shader in Redshift?
Yeah, I think so.
So I've got this. I've got my lovely green to purple kind of.
I can't see your screen. I don't know if anyone else can.
Oh.
Oh, there we go.
Oh,
See it.
okay. Right, that's all right. Phew. So all I did was I created this car from the asset browser. And then I went into the material. So let's just, you can see my workflow. So into the asset browser, search for car, double click car. There we go, that was easy, wasn't it? The car body material, I'm going to have a look in here. Obviously it's PBR, so it's all done in the reflectance channel. They've got a softening reflectance layer in there. I'm just going to get rid of for a second. But under layer 1 is simply a color that they're using for the red. I'm going to swap that out for a Fresnel shader. And what a Fresnel shader does is it works out stuff towards around the edges, and you can control stuff. Very good for faking subsurface scattering. And all I need to do here is pick the color. There we go, let's do it this way, it's much easier. Dunk. So this one I want to be purple, and this one I want to be green. And there it is. There is my Fresnel shader, so that based on the angle that you look at will depend on which bits are green and which bits aren't. That one was easy for me. I have no idea how that works in Redshift. Ooh, shall I cheat?
Let me just have a look. So you would be.
Let's see how this works. Where is the Redshift thingy?
You're going to convert it?
Yeah, I was going to see what it did.
Is it done in the reflectance channel?
Yeah,
Yeah,
it doesn't work in the reflectance channel, does it?
Try it, but that's the issue with converting C4D to Redshift is incapable of reading the different layers
Reflectance channel.
in the reflectance
Damn.
channel. Yes. Which is a bit of an issue.
Yes, I have black, which doesn't really help me. So over to you, Ellie.
So I haven't really done it.
No, I've never. So I've done it in cinema before, but I've never done it in Redshift, so I'm unsure.
Yeah, so I can't get it based on the angle at which you look. I can get like well, kind of. Okay, let me just share my screen. Kind of.
Yeah. Okay.
Kind of not done it, to be honest. Not like yours. Let me share my screen.
Yep.
Oh, cool. Right. So yeah, the Fresnel didn't really like it. So this, if I can you see my screen? Yeah. Good.
Yes. Yeah, we can.
Cool. Let me just move this down so you can kind of see what's going on. So we sort of have this effect, which uses a Redshift state node. And so if we plug that in, this is exactly what this is doing. And we can sort of adjust it based on camera. And so the colors are going to change dependent on the way the camera is facing. And then you can, then the RS state node is plugged into like what's called a vector change range. And this will allow us to change the colors of our RS state node by plugging it into the diffuse. And so I need more of like a change. Here we go. So why, when I change that, is it not giving me enough of a, so basically if you mess with these values enough, you can.
I found a tutorial. But sadly it's not cinema. It is Redshift, but it's not cinema.
Yeah, so I used to mess with this kind of stuff, and you kind of get these nice iridescent things.
Yeah.
But you have to tweak these textures quite a bit. So the Fresnel, yeah, so plugging the Fresnel into the diffuse didn't really do what I thought it would do, if that makes sense.
Yeah. I'm just seeing what I can find. This is a good question. This is a stump.
This is a good question because I do not know.
So you need some form of RS state node into RS vector change range.
Oh my god, can we please clarify that this is exactly set up that I just did?
Yeah,
But
with RS material.
Yeah, but I knew this is how you do it, but it's about tweaking these.
In between the RS change range and the RS material, they've also got an RS color correct.
Oh, that would be just to fix the
And
hue and
then
everything.
change the mapping.
I don't get why I can't find the values that look.
Old range minimum -1, -1, -1. Old range maximum 1, 1, 1.
Oh, hang on. Wait. Plugged into the wrong thing. Input. Right, go on, tell me again. Old range min.
-1, -1, -1, and then 1, 1, 1. There you go. You've got the green to kind of.
Yes. I knew it was possible with this setup.
Yeah, and then I've got new minimum range 0, 0, 0 and new range maximum 1, 1, 1. Yeah, so there it is. Woo, look at that.
Yeah, and then they would use the color correct to adjust the hue. Color, where are you? Color correct. Goodbye for now. You are not needed. Input, diffuse, and then.
Oh, look at that.
Yay. So yes, RS state node, vector change range, then color correct. And then what I do, so I adjust these values and you can get, even without the color correct, like a change in the sort of hue that you'd want.
That's
So you
cool.
can adjust these values to get these sort of different things. And then, yeah, dependent on where you look at it, you're going to remain getting that kind of look. I'm glad.
Woohoo. Oh, we've got the question.
Oh, I think I'm
Why
hearing
would
it
you
now.
use Redshift? Is it more accurate, faster, realistic? Is
Yes
it the
to all
kind
those
of,
things.
yeah, pretty much. Is it kind of the next step for using standard and then physical? Redshift is a physical renderer. So there's two different types of rendering in kind of cinema. There is the standard sort of side, which is the standard renderer, and then there is a physical style. Now, we had a previous physical renderer as well called ProRender. We have a physical GPU renderer called Physical, and Redshift is actually, sorry, what a cat going crazy. Redshift is actually a physical type of renderer, except that it works on a GPU. So it takes advantage of the number of graphics cards you have in your computer rather than the CPUs. So it's better to work that way. It's faster. It is a fast renderer. You can see just from the reactions for Elly's screens that it's just super quick.
So I use Redshift all the time for things now, and it is, like, granted, it is a steep learning curve. Like, I would definitely recommend it if you are a beginner in Cinema 4D. There is no reason why you shouldn't be creating your materials inside of standard and looking at the kind of the render settings in there, because it gives you that nice base knowledge and that base information of how things work. And so if you know you need to switch on a certain thing in the reflectance channel, and you know you need to kind of have a normal map or a bump map, when it comes to then using Redshift and in particular node materials, you already know what the terminology is and also what those things do. So you know, if you want to create or use a normal map for something, you need to get a bump node and plug it into the bump because you've already done it inside of Cinema 4D standard materials. And so I think it
Plus, if you're
definitely
creating standard materials that you've made yourself, you can then convert those really easily to Redshift and learn how they're put together.
as
If you're
long as you're
making
not
your
using a
own
reference
ones,
channel.
yeah, in a standard workflow, not a PBR workflow, you'll be all right.
Yeah. Yes.
Right,
So I'm
that's
very
it.
aware it is 4 o'clock. Yeah. Sorry that I know that last little bit was a little bit kind of watching us kind of randomly work, but we got to the outcome. So
We did.
hopefully it was still beneficial. What am I looking for? This is what I'm looking for. So let me just kick this off. So to everyone who is still here with us, thank you so much for being part of these sessions, whether you joined into one of them or whether you were here for all 6. It's been an absolute pleasure for me and Matt to be kind of on this journey with you guys, whether you were beginners or whether you had used Cinema 4D before. Hopefully we've been able to give you at least some kind of information to help you kind of going forwards with your learning. A little recap of the stuff that we've done, in case you do want to have a look back onto the YouTube channels and see what exactly was in each of the sessions. So in week 1, we looked at navigating around Cinema 4D, and in particular, we looked at the new UI of version 25 because it is drastically different, as we've all kind of like witnessed now. And we also looked at primitives and how to kind of adapt and change these with things called deformers. In week 2, we went into some modeling techniques. In particular, we looked at splines and generators, as well as a bit of like box and SDS modeling and the new spline importer. So if you have like SVG files or Illustrator files, definitely check that out, how to kind of get that workflow. Week 3, we looked at some lighting, in particular 3-point lighting and HDRI images with a sky. And we also looked at understanding materials and created some of our own. Week 4, we looked at animating using keyframes, and we also looked at dynamics. We did a little bit of kind of rigid and collider body, and we did a tiny little bit of soft body based on the Q&A as well. Week 5, so last week, we looked at all things to do with MoGraph, including the cloner and the Voronoi fracture, and then we looked at how we can kind of change and affect those setups using things called effectors and fields. And then today we looked at all things to do with rendering inside of Cinema 4D with a focus on standard and physical. So we looked at ambient occlusion, global illumination, all that cool stuff. We had a little look at some Redshift. In particular, we looked at, MoGraph Colour in standard and in Redshift, and also how to kind of color with Vertex maps. So some useful links for kind of things beyond this course, because as we know, this is now over, sadly. Any future sessions you want to kind of be a part of or see what's going on, just check out the Maxon events page, which is maxon.net/events. Everything on there, all of our future events, webinars, sessions, whatever they may be, will all be on there for you guys to register. For further learning, we have our own YouTube channel. Just go onto YouTube and search Maxon Training Team, and then we will pop up. So all of our sessions are recorded, or more often than not, most of our sessions are recorded, and we put them on there. And majority of them are also time-stamped. So, you don't necessarily have to worry about watching the whole thing. You can find a specific thing that is useful for you and check out the timestamp. Any Cinema 4D questions, we actually have a live Ask the Trainer next Thursday, which we all sit on the webinar for an hour, and we answer your questions on Cinema 4D, Redshift, and Red Giant live for you straight on there. That's about an hour, and it is 4 p.m. UK time. And for anyone who is still here listening to me go on, we would really appreciate any feedback on this course. And so at the very end of this session, as soon as we end the webinar, there is actually a survey where you can leave feedback based on kind of the things you liked, the things you thought we could do better, and any kind of future topics that you want to see us kind of take on. Let us know, because we absolutely do read all of those comments and questions, so don't think we don't. And if you do want to get in touch with us, feel free to drop us an email at training@maxon.net. And for the last time, Matt, thank you so much for being part of this course. We love it, and I love doing this this style of stuff with you. So
You're welcome. Thank you. And yeah, we look forward to the next one.
Yes, it's been so lovely to kind of see all of you guys, all the people that have been on here asking us questions. You really do make it, and then we are absolutely going to miss you next Wednesday when we don't have this. But don't worry, there will be plenty more courses, plenty more hands-on sessions, webinars, so you know we're not going anywhere.
Yeah. Thank you, Ellie. Thank you for organising and being a wonderful hostess.
No worries, my pleasure. So have a good rest of your week, everyone, and hopefully see you all soon.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye.